Welcome to the podcast. It's dedicated to making you a faster cyclist. The Ask a Cycling Coach podcast presented by TrainerRoad. I'm Coach Jonathan Lee with our head coach, Chad Timmerman.
Hey, everybody.
Squid Bikes, Ivy Audrain.
Hey, how's it going?
And then we also have Ice Friction and Specialized and the Feeds, Alex Wild. What's up, Alex?
Hey, guys.
Good to have you. Alex is nearby. We could have, and Ivy's nearby. We could have almost recorded an in-person one. But Chad, you had to stay up in the Northwest and, whatever, but we can make do. So today we are going to discuss how to do a fast 100-mile time. We're going to talk through a bunch of different things. We're going to talk about a 5-hour time that an athlete sent in, but then we're also going to talk about how to do a 4-hour century. And I basically want to convince you, Chad, to come down and do that with me, because I think that you could do a darn good job with this. Anywho, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about training at the bottom versus the top of the zones, whether that makes a difference, and lots of different things. It's going to be good. But first things first, head over to our YouTube channel and check out, we just released our latest Cycling Science Explained video. It goes into sprint intensity training, much like Chad did on the podcast. Basically, Chad does all the hard work, and then I just put it into a YouTube video.
Just regurgitate it in a more palatable manner.
There we go. Hey, that's it.
Doesn't make sense at all, but yeah.
yeah. Bad usage of the word palatable, Chad. But yes, anyways, people are loving it. It's a fantastic video. Go in there, check it out. We've got another one coming up soon. So go to our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/TrainerRoad. And if you're watching this live right now, give it a thumbs up, rate the podcast, share it with your friends. It's a huge help. Alex, you just did Crusher in the Tushar, which is a 70-mile gravel race, mixed surface, road and gravel. And you climbed 10,000 feet in 70 miles, which is just brutal. That's a lot of climbing for a short distance. And you were really looking forward to this one, but it didn't go well. So I want to talk about that. And I want to talk about what you've learned from the whole experience.
Yeah, I'd say I got crushed in the Tushar for sure. Yeah, I put a lot into it. I've been up in Tahoe now for 4 weeks. So did the altitude piece, did the training. And I guess backing up a little bit with volume being new for me this year, I think it's been a learning experience. Just the whole thing of kind of what my body can handle. It's a new training stress. It's a new approach. And then on top of that, just kind of what works for me. I think, as we've talked about before, all TSS is not created equal. So to put it in perspective, the 3-week camp I did before that race was 3,000 TSS, which is a lot, but it was built up of a lot of VO2 work. And for me personally, I think what I learned is that continued VO2 work, like we need it to like top up for races, but too much of it, I struggle to recover from quickly. Whereas like comparing it to, I think like Hawaii at the beginning of the year, I did a 32-hour week that was no VO2. It was all threshold, sweet spot endurance. And I came off that actually feeling pretty fresh. Like I didn't need a ton of time to recover from it. So I think we're moving forward going to be more prescriptive with that VO2 work. And if we need it, kind of giving more space between the end of it and the race. So taper off a little quicker. It's kind of a fun scenario where we learned that I like to keep the engine running, but not with VO2. So it's like keep the engine running and maybe switch over to like sweet spot going into the race. Because it like a typical taper of like kind of just cutting the volume and not doing much doesn't work for me personally. So it's a lot of just learning what works for me with this new volume structure. And, it sucks to learn that at a lifetime Grand Prix race, but such is racing.
Yeah, I want to point out that Alex is a unique bird. Like we're listening to this one, and I'm not the same as Alex. None of us that are listening to this are the same as Alex. Like Alex is a unique athlete, right? So what Alex is doing is not what all of us should do across the board. We probably all shouldn't go up to altitude and do 30 hours, something like that, 20 hours. And then as a result, like the taper is going to look probably quite different as well in terms of what you're doing there. Because there's a lot of athletes that the VO2 component is absolutely necessary in a taper, right? It's, and in a lot of cases, even with, even in long distance athletes, it can be helpful to have some intensity, but just, taper down appropriately coming into things. But it truly is.
I think the specifics change athlete to athlete, but I think what people should copy is the approach of like, okay, this is what I did going into this race. How did I feel? Did it go well? And we've talked about it before, the taper for everybody can be a little different, and you learn what works for you. So I wouldn't just take the VO2 piece and the volume piece from me, but I would take the approach of, okay, out of 10, this race went 10 out of 10. Okay, maybe this taper is what works for me, or it went 5 out of 10. Maybe there's some tweaks that I can make in there to make this taper more effective for me. So I think checking in with yourself and kind of going through that of how the training translated to racing is definitely something that can be passed on to every athlete. But yeah, I mean, everybody's a unique bird. I'd say like it can be interesting to see. Some people love like the traditional 10-day taper of just cutting volume and tapering in. I personally like to keep the engine running a little bit, and then, you know, everything in between. So I think figuring out what works for you in that space not only will make you race better, but it'll give you more confidence going into that race, knowing this is what I need to do to perform on that day. Mm-hmm. So I think that process is super important of kind of checking in with yourself there and not just taking the status quo as gospel.
That's why it's important to race a lot, right, Chad? Like, I mean, relatively speaking, but to give yourself this sort of dry run, trial run sort of an experience.
In general, yeah. And in Alex's position, especially because he, you know, his paycheck, his lifestyle depends on his performance. So for him to keep close tabs on how well he's performing in race scenarios is definitely important. But his point, I just want to further it and say that and agree with it completely, that take close notes, especially someone in his situation, but really everyone's, because and thorough notes at that, not just, you know, did this taper work for me, but what are all the other compounding factors that might have influenced this? You know, am I under a lot of live stress right now? Am I sleeping as well as I should? Did I go to altitude? Did I just get back from altitude, as in Alex's case, or are you still at altitude? So it's never going to be just as simple as did my taper work? It's all the other things that affect you as a rider, and how did the taper pile on top of that?
Yeah, well said, Chad. Ivy, speaking of events coming up, you and I are racing in 2 days. Mm-hmm. Actually, Alex is racing too, but Ivy and I are on a team. Alex will win.
Screw that guy.
Yeah, he's whatever. It's fine. He'll win. He'll be way ahead. But Ivy and I, we're racing relay. We pre-rode the course last week. Ivy, how are you feeling coming into it? You're going to do the second lap. I'll do the first lap. It's 32 miles each lap.
Super good. I had kind of a sharper workout on Tuesday with some of those shorter like VO2 efforts. And when I got done with it, I was like, man, I could do the whole thing all over again. I could do this workout times 2. Like, I feel great. So very excited.
Nice. Yeah. What are you going to do for the heat? Because your second lap, it's a high of like
stuck you in the heat of the day.
Hey, I'm so excited. First of all, not a morning person. I do not want to go first. Second, I do not want to deal with lap traffic and like a congested lap right away.
Those aggro guys at the start trying to go 2 laps real fast.
And like John has mentioned before, people will go extremely hard on the first climb and couple of climbs, and then get to the single track and start moving backwards, and it'll be kind of hairy. And I'm more than happy to let John navigate that first lap for me.
He's got some sharp elbows.
Yeah,
that's
great. And then I'll be, you know, making pour over coffees and just chilling, waiting for my turn, and it'll be great. So
chilling, like literally ice vest. I mean, what are you going to do? Go into it?
Chilling. Finding some AC. I think hydration the day before and obviously before the event. I'm not going to wait till the race to start drinking electrolytes. So I think that'll be important for me. Ice socks during the race. That's about it. It sounds like kind of trivial, but doing things like, I have a hand-me-down skin suit. My custom stuff is still getting made for my new team. And so I have a hand-me-down Squid skin suit. That's kind of like the heavier cyclocross material that I was going to wear, but even stuff like just opting for like a thinner jersey and bibs and stuff like that, I think all that little stuff makes a difference. So,
yeah. And what are the temps supposed to be?
It's supposed to be 90 degrees up in Truckee, but 90 degrees at Truckee feels pretty, because you're pretty high elevation, feels hot. And that last climb is just purely exposed as we climbed up and found out the other day. So
it makes a big difference too. A little bit of tree cover, a little bit of cloud cover can make a huge impact on
Yeah.
especially climbs where the wind's low.
So
Yeah.
that said, I think I don't know, might talk to John about this. I think I'm still just going to do 2 big bottles on my bike. And then there is a feed zone. I really don't want to stop, but if I have to like really briefly stop and top off at the last kind of like slow speed feed zone before the final climbs, I'll do that. And then I think I'll be okay. Or if it's
The last 5 feed zones of Tushar, if it makes you feel better.
it does, thank you.
Yeah. Alex, so this one, the feed zone that we have at the end, this is a good point, Ivy. Let's say you stop at the feed zone and it takes you a grand total of 15 seconds to stop, right? And to keep going. So maybe with the acceleration and deceleration, you lose a total of 25 seconds total in that stop. But that 25 seconds of having fresh, cold water to be able to take on that last climb, even if you don't end up drinking it, just pouring it on yourself would be hugely beneficial.
It'll repay itself.
I would think so.
Very
Yeah.
probably.
And this one also, the feed zone, right, Alex? It's at the base of the last climb, and it's one where you're climbing at a slow pace anyway. So at least the last time I did it, I was able to call out for water and they just jogged right next to me because it was uphill and I was slow enough that maybe at Alex's pace, it's different. But
from what I remember, it's like you kind of come down and there's like that steep little kicker to the left. And actually it's like a slight descent after it. So the reacceleration, I'd say, is less of an issue because you're essentially stopped. That steep like left is pretty steep. So it's you're moving nowhere. And then you kind of just roll down the hill. I always err on the side of stopping if you have no water is a better idea. I mean, in mountain biking, drafting is not a huge thing. Like maybe if it like drops you off the back of a really fast peloton, you hopefully have friends too that you could be like, hey, your water bottle looks kind of full there, buddy. But I mean, in a race like Tahoe Trail, I feel like you're going to make up that 15 seconds probably on the climb after that feed zone by not dying. So
yeah,
I mean, I'm kind of jealous now because I just figured out that y'all don't have to do the super climb of climbing that and then starting the second lap. You guys get to hand off. That's always like, I think the one that people like, it sneaks up on them at Tahoe Trail is they look at the lap, but they don't realize the last climb of the first lap and the first climb of the second lap are like kind of one super climb.
Yeah, because the descent is pretty active. You don't really get to relax on that descent. And then all of a sudden you're going up and you're like, oh, geez, I remember how hard this was.
Yeah. And it's pretty short, that descent. I mean, and then it's just, like you said, a lot of corners. So you're like, a lot of body English. But no, I'm excited for it. I love that race.
In terms of aid stations, one takeaway for everybody on this is there's an aid station that comes before this, but you pass it at speed. But it's the first one you come to for quite a while. It's very tempting to stop at it. It's a bigger aid station. It has more things, but it's always worse to stop at an aid station when you're carrying speed than stopping at an aid station where you're going slow on a climb anyway. Those ones you're going to lose a whole lot less time to folks there. And Ivy, speaking of losing time and all that stuff, I have no clue where we're going to finish because I don't know who's racing, but is our goal still a podium?
Yeah, for sure. Of course, but
pretty sweet.
I think instead of the unknown factor being the people we're racing against, it will be if I perish or not is the biggest unknown here. So I'll do my best.
I think hydration is going to be the biggest thing because it's up high enough that and it's dry air. So you just lose your sweat. You don't accumulate sweat. It just like disappears from you real quick. And, so it's really easy to get dehydrated up there for sure. And so especially in the heat. So
it will be nice that, go ahead.
I was going to say Jeff Kabush and Katarina Nash are racing. And I was really terrified that they would be doing the relay. Cause if so, goodbye, first place for darn sure. But yeah, I think they're just racing individually. So sigh of relief, but this is going to be a fun one. I'm excited for it. I think people can follow along with live timing on Athlinks. You could follow Alex, see if Alex can go under 2 hour lap times, which I think he will. So, which would be pretty sweet, Alex. And then for Ivy and I, we'll see if we can go. I think 5 hours is what we put the over under on. So if you're watching live right now, let us know over under 5 hours. Which do you say? Are we going to go over? Are we going to go?
No pressure.
You think under, Alex?
I'm going under, confidently under.
I think when I did it last time, I paced it what I feel like pretty conservatively. I was just trying to pace well and prove to myself that I didn't suck at pacing. I did 4:42 was my total time. So I think, and that was very much like keeping a lot in the tank, to make sure that I wasn't just blowing up or anything. So I think it's possible. I'd really like to get close to a 2:10 lap time. I don't know. I don't think I could do a 2:10, but get as close as I can to it, right? Like strive for that would be the goal.
To achieve, you must first believe.
Indeed. And try.
You got to tell yourself you're going sub 2:10.
Yeah. We're going to go full gas, Alex.
There you go.
Dropping the hammer.
Full send.
That's exactly.
Talking of aid stations, it reminded me, who's that famous video of the triathlete who like purposely smacked all the water bottles?
Oh, was that Macca back in the day?
Probably.
Seems like a Macca thing, but there is, I know that video. Yeah. Where they like smacked him out of the way. So then their other competitors
that is dirty pull right there.
So the Tushar course goes up a big climb and then you drop down into like Circleton and you do like a little loop in town. And then you go back up and finish at the resort. And when we took a right going just about to start the second big climb, and there's all these volunteers and they were all like kids. I think it was like a Boy Scout or something that were volunteering for the race with water bottles. And I was in the front of the group. And so I tried to grab the first one and the cap was off. So I squeezed it and had like 2 ounces left, and then tried to go for the next one. And I think by the 5th one, I got one, but all I could think was like from behind, it just looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. There's 2 different strategies with that though. Right. And the triathletes that are listening to this can confirm. Part of it is, when you're running and it's hot conditions, like for sure, it's something like world championships or just any hot race. You grab every single one of the cups that you can and you pour that over yourself, or you put it into your jersey, or you put that ice into the hat, or you put it down the hatch and you drink it. But you do all that stuff because you're trying to cool off. But then on top of that, if there is someone right behind you, it just happens to have the effect that it makes it so that they can't grab anything. So there's kind of like there's a sneaky strategy to that one for sure.
Just wanted to make it clear that I'm uncoordinated and not that mentally evil.
Let's go into Ryan's question. He says, "Hey, TrainerRoad, love the podcast and really helps me get through those longer turbo sessions while listening along. My question is about when interval training at intensity is better to do, or when interval training at any intensity. Is it better to do less intervals toward the top of the zone, or more intervals at a slightly lower target, therein accruing more training time in an energy system, albeit at a lower percentage of that zone? I'm always questioning which could be better when training. For example, if I was working on the VO2 system, doing 5-minute intervals, would I be better doing 2 to 3 intervals at 120% of my FTP, or 5 intervals at 110%, as I could never manage 5 at 120%? Says you now at this point, Ryan, but perhaps you can with more training. And then Ryan notes, but could do 5 at this lower percentage of the target. So basically the question is, top of the zone or bottom of the zone enabling you to do more intervals. That's the hypothetical being pitched here. Thanks, guys, and look forward to your answer. Alex, you and I have talked about this a lot. How do you do that when you're training and you have goals? And for those that don't know, when you're training inside, it gives you a specific power target and you go for that. When you train outside, it gives you a window, and we give you a window that's typically somewhere around like a 20-watt window to work with. So in the middle is typically where the target would be if you were riding inside. And then we give you 10 watts shy and north of that. So then that way it gives you a little bit of flexibility. So this is what we do for our outside workouts with TrainerRoad. And Alex, you have a window as well when you do your workouts. Do you shoot for the top?
Mine's just 1 watt
for the bottom. Yeah. Yeah. Clay, yeah, he smooths with 1 second, which is psychopathic, but just the same. Alex, what do you do? Do you shoot for the top or bottom?
I used to shoot for the top. Hammerhead actually unexpectedly helped me with this because it doesn't pull in the range. It just pulls in the middle number. And then on top of that, I think it gives me peace knowing that the TSS for every workout is based on that middle number, not hitting the top of it. So it only shows me 1 number. And so now I feel like I'm shooting for the top because I just try to hit that 1 number, but it actually puts me in the middle, which I think is way better. I wouldn't say my habit of shooting at the top was good, but if the TrainerRoad listeners haven't realized I'm type A by now, I think we're a lost cause. So
yeah. Yeah.
I think Yeah, just I shoot from the middle now.
Yeah, and
Chad, what's it
kudos to Hammerhead for recognizing that, because it is a range, but it's not as though the physiological happenings or the stimuli happen at the bottom of the range are different from the ones that happen at the top of the range. We're really just trying to put riders within a range where these things are likely to occur. It's never going to be a hard number. It's always going to be padded on each side. So the fact that they recognize we're just going to eliminate the padding, focus on the middle, because most of what we're trying to achieve physiologically is probably happening, and rewarding that behavior and just noting that behavior and that data, it makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, this is if you're training inside, you'll notice that as your workouts progress and you see your progression levels go up, you'll likely work your way from the bottom of a zone toward the top, like little by little, week over week. You'll creep up in your percentage that you do. And the goal there is to incrementally increase your abilities within a specific energy system. When you're outside, you have kind of a bit of autonomy to work with there, and saying that you have kind of like a range and you just shoot within that as much as you can. But this is, so I shoot for the middle, but at the same time, I can allow myself to go higher or lower. And that's just fine as well. Ivy, you're not, I don't know if you have anything to add to this.
Oh yeah, I challenge Ryan to do a workout outside. And then I feel like the wondering of, oh, should I have 5% here or 5% there? It will be so hard to just stay anywhere in that range when you first start doing it. Or even if you're experienced at it, I still have a hard time sometimes depending on the day and the effort, but yeah, pretty trivial when you're outside and just trying to hold the target.
And I think too, when we often discuss the whole idea of minimum effective dose, it kind of distracts from the fact that we're not just chasing the physiology. I mean, ideally, we want these physiological stimuli to present themselves so that our bodies adapt accordingly. But there are other things that are taking place. We're not just about the physiology. So if it were just about the physiology, yeah, work at the bottom end of the range, because if you can get the adaptations there, why would you work any harder? Why would you impose any more recovery time on yourself? Why would you make it more painful than it needs to be, et cetera? But you get other things while you're maybe moving toward the middle of that range, the top of that range, and even just doing more reps at the bottom of that range. Just the biomechanical breakdown that could happen as you do more intervals than your body is accustomed to. Well, if you're just chasing the physiology and you just do the bare minimum to elicit that specific set of responses, you don't necessarily expose yourself to how hard it is or challenging or how much focus it requires to ride really well when fatigue is creeping up. So it's not just about the physiological adaptations. There are other things going on that are worth your concern.
This is the importance of having like a properly structured plan, for sure, right? That gets you to a spot where you know what you need to do that day, rather than guessing and thinking, well, maybe I can just do it lower and squeeze in more. Because it's really easy to get yourself into a really fatigued state when you do that, and a negative one that makes the subsequent workouts too difficult to be able to do. The whole concept, though, it's like VO2 max. Let's focus on VO2 max in particular. Really, one of the main goals of VO2 max is to accumulate time at peak aerobic uptake. And when you do this and you're looking at it, yeah, there's a ton of different ways to achieve that. We have like reduced amplitude bill-out workouts that are going to have repeats that are like high VO2, and then you'll settle in at like threshold or sweet spot for 15 seconds, and you'll repeat those for a set, right? And those will get you to peak aerobic uptake, just like doing something like 30-30s, just like doing something like a sustained 5-minute VO2 interval. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, but the goal is to achieve time at peak aerobic uptake. And if you spend too much time there and you're not used to it, you just go full to 100. It's, even if you think that you're dropping it down to 110% and I'm doing more intervals, that can incur a lot of stress. So I think that, like, in theory, this question is a good one to consider. Is it better to do something at the bottom or the top? But the answer, as always, is it depends. It depends on what your current capabilities are, right, Chad?
And you could also look at it as more, there's more flexibility the earlier in your training phases than that you are. So if you're in base phase, that range is pretty accommodating. Work at the low end, work at the middle, work at the high, bounce back and forth repeatedly. But as you move into build, and it gets more specific, and then you're specializing, and it gets really specific, you work where you need to work to race the best. So that's probably going to be up at the high end of things. It's probably going to be something like you just described, Jonathan, where it's hyper specific, where it's really high efforts, and then the recovery is still pretty close to threshold, and then it's high efforts again. And at that point, we're still trying to stimulate the VO2 system, and we're still trying to achieve certain benefits and improvements, but we're also trying to make the athletes super accustomed to what it is they're going to have to do, physiological adaptations aside.
Yeah, for sure. And there's certain, also the lower the energy system, there's inherently more flexibility as well, right, Chad? When you're talking about endurance, for example, that window might be a bit bigger,
wider range,
right? And then as the zones get higher, it gets narrower.
Yeah,
that's what it does.
That pretty much sums it up.
Yeah, absolutely. So in theory, to answer your question directly here, one is not necessarily better than the other. And there isn't like a specific one that should be the right way to go when you reach a certain point or anything like that. It's all based on what you're currently doing and moving forward, and you should trend it appropriately. So I know, like, for example, if I was doing a bunch of 30-30s for my VO2 work, then I just gave myself 5x5 right after that. Woof, that would be really tough, right? So you need to work your way through things progressively. So plug for adaptive training. Trevor says, question mostly for Ivy. I'm going to sign up for. No, sorry, Trevor. I almost said that I'm going to win, and I don't want to put that on you. I'm going to sign up for single speed cyclocross world championships. And I'm wondering how I should adjust my training for single speed cross. Should I do my short efforts on climbs at a low cadence, add some extra high cadence drills, standing start drills? Should I practice beer hand ups during my intervals or during my rest periods? Good question from Trevor. We actually, Ivy, on our ride, had a couple folks that were on single speeds when we pre-rode the Tahoe Trail 100 course. So
let's say relevant a couple people who are doing beer hand-ups.
Yeah.
You were going.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, oh, we went out the deep.
Chad's like, shoot, wish I was there. So Ivy, we talked quite a lot, about quite a few tips on this. What suggestions would you have for Trevor?
So there are ways in which you can train like physiologically to make sure you're prepared for that low cadence, high torque effort. But I think the best way to prepare for this, and this will carry into all other aspects of off-road riding, to be really good on a single speed bike and the goal is to reduce those number of high torque instances. So it's primarily about carrying momentum. So you'll notice, like, when we were pre-riding with the single speed mountain bikers, if there was any amount of like downhill before a steep climb, or just any opportunity to build up a bunch of speed and momentum before those steep sections, they would capitalize on it and carry a bunch of speed into the base of that climb, so they didn't start the climb already in a high torque effort. And so Trevor should set up their bike as a single speed as soon as they can, so they can practice, like, find somewhere with flat single track where you can really practice carrying your speed through all these tricky sections, up short climbs, and see what it feels like to carry a bunch of momentum, and try to reduce those really like slow speed, high torque instances so that you can go faster. And that will carry into all sorts of off-road riding and really benefit you in a lot of ways. But yeah, if you can commit to not braking, carrying your speed, that's how you really prepare well for racing single speed.
That's something that benefits all of us, regardless of whether we're riding a geared bike
brakes.
or not.
Yeah, just commit to non-braking if you can.
And brakes do just slow you down, right? So,
I'm thinking specifically about, on cross courses where they do pretty silly stuff. They're like, oh no, how do we make this spot of the course more interesting? Let's just make an S turn really tight. I don't know. And so if you can figure out how to roll through that stuff without hitting the brakes too much and while carrying a bunch of speed without crashing, it just means that you don't have to step on the gas as much when you get out of that corner.
From a training perspective, yeah.
The amount of times I don't charge my ETAP battery, I feel like this is really helpful.
Yeah, we're just one dead battery, bent derailleur hanger, or snapped cable away from riding single speeds. All of us that are riding gear bikes, right? So
that's real.
Chad, from a training perspective, there's probably some chance for building specificity here too, right?
Always. And first and foremost, I mean, if you're serious about beer on course, you have to be able to take a hand up, whether you're working, resting, it doesn't matter. So you got to practice all of it. You got to get good at all of it.
Chad's always ready for
carries. Always. But that carries. I mean, it's the same idea. You you can look at the demands of a course. You can look at all the things that are going to influence how you need to race to be able to perform best on the day. And there will be a high level of specificity to that. But if you don't have a well-rounded set of capabilities, it's going to hamper you at some point. So it doesn't matter if you're super good at carrying speed and you're really good at avoiding these high torque, low speed moments. They're still going to happen from time to time. And if you don't know how to weather them, deal with them, then you're doing yourself a disservice. So I'm not saying you focus your time on the unlikely, but you do have to expose yourself to it so that when it does happen, and it will happen, you're at least adept at handling it.
There's part of when you're doing intervals and you're doing all that stuff, we preach this over and over. Although at times you'll see our workout text is going to have you working low, working high, working somewhere in that typical middle ground of 85 to 95. But take the liberty to be able to explore the different range, explore the space, as Christopher Walken said in that SNL skit. But explore the range of cadence that you anticipate that you'll be coming across on race day. It's because it really does make a difference, particularly if you have really long climbs that are just, dragging you along and you're stuck in whatever gear you have. I'm sure that all of us on geared bikes have had hard days. Alex, this might have been you up Crusher and the Tushar, where you kept clicking that downshift, hoping for another gear, but that's just what you got, right? And when that happens,
worst feeling in the world.
Yeah.
No, you're lying to me. Come on.
Yeah. I think the worst feeling is actually needing it, because when you finally do click that tiny gear, if you have it, it just means you're going to go slower and it's going to take longer to get to where you need to be.
That's true. Yeah.
Chad, super good live question too about prepping. How do we not, from the homie Grant, how do we not hurt our backs during single speed cyclocross, which is important too. Like thinking about like the whole body demands and how to prevent fatigue. And
because you pedal with your ears when you're down in that low gear, right? I mean, like every part of your body is working toward moving that bike forward.
Having practiced low speed, high torque moments and recognizing how difficult they are and how they do kind of, they ask things of your body that you wouldn't normally impose on it. It'll shine a really bright light on where your deficiencies lie. And if you're not strong in your midsection, in your body in general, I mean, shoulders to hips, the legs obviously drive the bike, but everything from the shoulders to the hips, I mean, to the hands and then some have to be strong as well. So I think that those low speed, high torque moments are really good opportunities for you to recognize, oh, I'm really solid on the bike. I'm really strong. I can remain stable, keep traction, push a big gear when I need to, or I'm actually very deficient. I kind of fall apart, and maybe even I get injured because my body just isn't that strong, which, points to, strength training, but strength training doesn't always have to mean weights. And I think when it comes to creating torque in a particular position, we can get really specific with isometrics, just holding a plank. I said to Nate when he was on last time, the minimum requirement for a plank for any cyclist should be 2 minutes. If you can't plank for 2 minutes as a cyclist, you're doing yourself a disservice. It's just another opportunity for you to improve how well you can perform on a bike, how well you can stabilize, how minimally you can hemorrhage energy that you want to be putting into the pedals, but instead you're dissipating in the form of all types of body movement that aren't helping you go faster. And then it grows from there.
The entire house, but you can still do 2 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, it doesn't have to be a pretty 2 minutes, but even that 2 minutes can lend some insight. If the first minute's a breeze and then you start to fall apart and your hips start to fall apart over the last minute, well, yeah, maybe you got that minute in there, but you're not exactly strong enough to do 2 minutes. So this is something you should work on. And I promise it'll carry really nicely to how well you handle your bike, how well you maintain control over the course of long rides.
I found that with athletes, when back pain happens, that sort of thing. So this is actually a lot like strength training. So if you're in sprinting, you can find this as well. You can find voids of like tension and control in your body when you do something. So if you watch like a really bad deadlift happen, you'll see that void open up typically as a bend in the back that shouldn't be there, right? When somebody's doing a bad deadlift and they're not strong enough, they usually bend at their weakest point. And on the bike, you'll find yourself and pay attention to where you're just bending a ton and there's a lot of movement going on. We talked about this in the Sprinting 101 video, and Nate's technique that he was doing was allowing a huge amount of wiggle in his midsection. That was like the decoupling point. Whereas if you watched Pete, it was just solid. There was just no bending, no shifting, no movement. from his hips all the way up to his neck, right? It was just solid. And I've found that when I'm super fatigued and technique has completely gone out the window and I'm pedaling like crazy, pay attention to where you have a lot of body movement going on. And chances are that's a good indication of a spot where, like, yeah, it's probably going to be your midsection. And when your midsection is weak, that's going to cause you to really use a huge amount of, or pass a lot of strain onto your muscles in your lower back in particular. Causes athletes a whole lot of discomfort. So strength training helps a ton. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good point to cover. And this is, once again, it's a good example of how we can talk about something that's single speed, yet it applies to absolutely all of us. Because I bet we've all been on long climbs, which is long days, and our back is sore and painful and uncomfortable. I think it takes a tiny bit of discomfort to distract you from being able to fulfill your potential on a big day.
I think any cyclist could benefit from spending time on a single speed on variable terrain too, not just getting the single speed out early in the road season so that you can go do a climb at varied cadences. That's all good and fine. But being able to make a single gear work across all sorts of changes in terrain is just going to positively translate to everything else you need to do on a bike.
Fun challenge. And all of us that have gear bikes do technically have single speeds too, just don't shift. So that's there you go.
I was going to ask Ivy, do you ever use a geared bike? Like, because I'm 30,000 foot view here, never raced single speed, but with the gear changes, like, do you ever use it to like suss out a gear ratio, or is it just so far off that it doesn't help?
I think that the drivetrain efficiency between having a geared setup and then once you actually switch to a single speed feels so different. So you can have the same gear ratio on a single speed and with a geared bike, but once you actually get out riding on the course, it'll feel super different. So not totally equitable.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a good point though, right? It probably maybe gets you close to a ballpark, but chances are you probably already know where the ballpark is, right? In terms of where you need to be on gearing. So yeah. Let's get into Glenn's question. It says, hey team, longtime listener from the UK. I've probably listened to 300 podcasts over the last few years while renovating a house. Great job and brilliant advice. Good to hear, Glenn. Glad we can be your companion in that. Says, my question relates to a 100-mile rides at pace. A couple of years ago, a friend and I aimed to cycle 100 miles in less than 5 hours. In other words, holding a 20-mile-per-hour average on the flat. We set off doing 10-minute turns at the front and hit the 50-mile point averaging 21.4, and we were flying. As we turned, we realized there was a wind that had been helping us, and it got real quickly. The next 30 miles were at 18-mile-per-hour average, and it was tough. My friend hit the wall and dropped out, leaving me to do the last hour alone. But I managed to average 20.4 miles per hour and came in less than 5 hours, which was amazing. Way to go. That's a good one to hold on to, Glenn. Nice work. So
most impressed that this is in miles per hour.
Yes, I know, right? Yeah. Now a group of 4 of us are planning to do the same ride soon and aim for 22 to 23 miles per hour, given the larger group. However, we've been struggling to work out whether 10-minute turns at the front or alternating shorter turns, for example, like 1 minute, is the best strategy. I'm more of a diesel engine and can turn 10 minutes at threshold or higher, no problem, but all riders are different. So the question is, should we take standard 10-minute turns each, or take 1 minute turns each, or let each rider determine their max power versus time peak? The risk with the latter is that other riders aren't recovered and aren't ready to go. So thanks in advance, Glenn from England in the UK. Chad, I have like this whole kind of scenario worked out, but I actually kind of want to go into your advice first and what you would say in this case to Glenn. And then we can go through this hypothetical scenario where I want to invite you guys to join me to do a sub 4 100-mile event or effort. But anyways,
easy.
What would you? There we
Just
go.
kidding.
Yeah,
Just kidding.
You're in, Ivy.
It's just
Chad, what would you say
trying
to
to get his shift.
That's it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's going to determine this. So that's going to have to happen. Okay, this is a tough challenge. Just first off, I think 10-minute poles are really long poles. I would definitely make the poles shorter than that, because you can really burn somebody up in 10 minutes, especially if they're staring at a speedometer trying to keep a particular speed over a course that's changing. So that's the second issue, is having speed goals is all good and fine if you're averaging it over, just like power, averaging it over a period of time that makes sense. Because trying to keep a particular speed on a 2% downhill or on a flat versus even a 3 or 4% uphill is gonna drastically change the requirements of the rider at the front of the field. So honestly, all of this kind of brings me back to a race I did years back. It doesn't matter when. It was a race around Lake Tahoe, and Lake Tahoe is 72 miles around. And we did it a few years in a row. And one of the years, a fellow rider who is very competitive, awesome Palmares, this guy's been racing forever and winning forever, Jeff Angerman, for those who know him, we lined up and said, let's just try to get under 3 hours, just trying to breathe some new life into a race that we've done a couple of times and wanted to set a new challenge for ourselves, which means 24 miles per hour average. Ooh. I'll tell you, we didn't stare at our speedometers the whole time saying, oh, I'm at 12 miles per hour on an 8% climb, I need to go 24. We rather just buried ourselves and it handled itself. We just went as hard as we could because our limitations are what they are. We're either going to make it in time or we're not. And I know it's more yeah, exactly. And I know it's more reassuring. It's reassuring to have a pacing pattern and say I'm abiding that pacing pattern, so I am on pace to accomplish my goal. But at the same time, if you get so hung up in that pattern or that pacing goal, it can negatively affect what you're actually achieving. So
particularly with speed, like what we're talking about here, that's the speed one is super complicated because
unless you're doing
reason.
an hour attempt, world hour attempt, and it's going to be exactly the same course lap after lap after lap, and it's a dead flat course. I mean, speed's not really going to be the best metric to use. Average speed averaged over 20 minutes or 15 minutes or certain increments could be useful too, but just trying to hold, and I'm sure he's already considered this. I don't think Glenn is just talking about going out there and just pinning it at a particular miles per hour. I'm being literal here, but I do just want to warn him, caution him when it comes to trying to modulate your effort over the course of this. Just be open to the variables that aren't going to be reflected in the speed across the course. And let me talk about some of those, because I did a 40K team time trial effort and we did win the state title, and it was a small field, but it was a competitive one.
Got to show up.
And that's cool, but we could have done it so much better because it was an out and back, and we tore butt on the way out to the point where we're like, we're going to set a world record here. This is ridiculous. And then turned around and realized it was a block headwind. Yeah, exactly. It was a block headwind or tailwind on the way out. So, I mean, at some point, reason should have dawned. We should have said, we're not this fast, but we had a tailwind. And then we had to pay for it on the way back, having completely buried ourselves on the way out. I fell off. The next rider was stuck finishing time, just fell. It was still a fast enough time, but it was not even close to on pace with the way out. So I think what I'm talking to here is just be realistic in your expectations. Just if you do have any sort of compounding factors that put you ahead of pace, behind pace, just assess them for what they are. Don't just assume I'm crazy fast today or I'm crazy slow today. There's probably something else in the mix there. And then the cohesiveness of the group. Do you want to comment on that, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think that's like a super, well, actually, I don't need to jump in on it. You can carry on, because I think we're going to end up covering our own cohesiveness, because you all are going to join me to set this record anyway. So
cool. Yeah. Well, okay. And that's it too. So the cohesiveness of the group. So if you're assigning 10-minute intervals to each rider, some riders aren't going to be able to maintain that speed. Some riders, just a strong 10-minute pull isn't really in their wheelhouse. Maybe they're better at shorter, stronger 2 or 3 minute pulls. And then the stronger riders, it's not pull harder, it's pull longer, right? That's the way you keep the group working together. You don't drop the weaker riders, rather you stay in front longer, work longer at the same pace that everyone's doing, and then, move off and slot back in. But the cohesiveness of the group is a big deal. Even if your capabilities are similar across the members of this group, you are still going to have some people who are a bit blowhard in nature, some people who are very accommodating and will acquiesce and do whatever is necessary to please everybody else because they think that's what's necessary of them, when in fact, all it's going to do is blow them up 40 miles into a 100-mile effort. So you do have to recognize even the personalities of the people who are part of this group, because getting that out of the way early on, recognizing, okay, you're the leader, you're clearly a strong leader, you're sensible, you have a good head, you're not going to make people do things that are beyond their capabilities, whereas you are just about finishing under the required time, and you will bury all of us because that's your focus. So get a sense of that. The cohesiveness is not just as you're rolling through taking turns, it's also personality based. So it's not a bad idea to have a finger on that pulse. And then the starting pace, my best team time trial, I think it was a 4-man, 3-man, doesn't matter, was when we started at a dreadfully slow pace. So slow that I was like, this is great. Our race is basically over in the first 5 minutes of what will probably be a 35-minute effort, because we're going so slow right now. This is ridiculous. But it was just a very gradual escalation into the speed that we got to and kept for the remainder of the time trial, and we blew everyone's doors off. So, and the lesson here is, if you go out too hard, it's just going to hamper you for the entire remainder of whatever. And this is a long 100 miles, not a 40K TT. So be conservative as you begin, regardless. I mean, it can feel this is just too slow. It should probably feel too slow. And how quickly you get up to speed is entirely up to you. Get there in 5 minutes, get there in over the course of the first hour. It doesn't matter. But once you get there, be confident that you can stay there.
The way that, so there's a bunch of things that are really important with this when you're talking about rolling turns with other people with a specific goal to achieve. And a lot of that is order too. So if Alex was in front of somebody like Nate, for example, Alex is small and slight, and Nate is gigantic. And as a result, that draft is not going to help Nate. So you're probably not going to want to put, if Nate is in a position where Nate's struggling in particular, you really want to change that order so that somebody in front of them is going to be able to give them a decent draft. Like Chad behind me, I wouldn't give Chad as big of a draft. And if Chad was in a situation where it's like, I think I'm going to be one of the weaker riders, you'd want to have a rider that's going to be bigger and stronger and give them a bit more of a larger pocket of air to work with there to stay in that draft. For sure.
And that's all good and fine to plan initially, but we're talking 100 miles here. I mean, that breaks down over the course of a 40K or 25-mile time trial. It's certainly going to break down over the 100 miles. So maybe another bit of advice is to be flexible in who does what, who's riding where, all the variables.
Yeah, well said. I'm going to get nerdy on this one. But first things I want to say with this is, when you're talking about what duration of pulls to take, everybody first needs to be really transparent with their fitness and how they've been training lately. And if you can get everybody a really clear fix on what they've been doing lately, then that should inform a lot of your decisions. It doesn't necessarily, like, Chad, let's just say, has been doing a ton of 30-30s recently and hasn't been doing a lot of sustained work. Chad might prefer shorter pulls. And whereas if Ivy has been going out and just doing big old diesel days, just rolling coal all day long, Ivy might prefer longer pulls. And everybody doesn't have to follow the same thing. And once again, like Chad said, super important, be flexible. You have to allow yourself to change, because the best laid plans, right, once you get out there, they change. And that's just how it goes. So you want to figure that out. But another way to look at this is a question of 10-minute versus 1-minute pulls. First of all, if you have like 4 to 5 riders, you're clearly not going to be able to do like 1-minute VO2 level pulls for an hour long. That's going to be really tough, and you're not going to be able to sustain it. Like, your power is going to drop over the course of that. But you can look at it in 2 different ways. Number one, what's the work to rest ratio? Just like you do in a workout. So, is it 1-to-1? I sure hope not. That means it's you and one other person, and you're just pulling, and just you two are working together. And if that's the case, you need to look at that realistically and think about, what could I do with equal parts rest, equal parts work for this 4-hour period, or however long we need to ride for this 100 miles, a 5-hour period, whatever it is. And if you think about it, try doing because there's this temptation, right? If we shrink the intervals down to 1 minute, then that means I can go super hard for that 1 minute. But in this case, you can't, because that would be like doing 30-30s for, 4 or 5 hours without any sort of breaks. Like, it's impossible if you're doing that at a high intensity. You just can't do it. So instead, you want to look at it in terms of work to rest ratio. What do you have? And then look at your training. What have you been able to do that's similar to that? And you probably want to shoot for something that's a bit conservative. And then you can surprise yourself later on if you can do a little bit extra. But in almost every case, I would advocate for shorter pulls, right, Chad? Just the long pulls, there's too much opportunity for accumulation of stress, building up of lactate, and then not being able to clear it. And then that has a compounding effect that carries into the next effort, which then only magnifies as those efforts continue. So I would absolutely shoot for short.
Definitely err on the more conservative side of things. And then that could change over the course of, again, this being a very long time trial, effectively a time trial, right? Then just because it's going to change, this is something we haven't really touched on yet, but there should be very open communication amongst the members of this team, because what you feel like in the beginning is absolutely going to change by the time you finish, and it's going to ebb and flow over the course of it. So you could have people who are in just kind of rough patches who need to take a shorter pull for a little while, but later may resurface and be able to take a longer, stronger pull because maybe they got back on top of their nutrition. Maybe they just overdid one effort or two or three in a row and needed a break. But these are all things you're only going to be guessing at if you're just taking timed 10-minute pulls and then swinging off. Whereas you take whatever pull it is and swing off, and as you're trailing back toward the end of the group saying, I need to sit on for a little while. I'm cooked. I missed my last gel. I need to make up for that and skip a couple turns. You're going strong. You holler out to that rider slipping off. No problem. I can go an extra couple of minutes or whatever, but be communicative and don't waste your time shouting at the front of the group. I don't imagine you guys are going to be going so fast and wearing aero helmets. I don't know that you can't hear each other, but it's really hard to hear what the rider in front of you is saying. So any communication, do it when you're alongside somebody. Otherwise you're just going to be barking noises at them that they're not going to be able to decipher.
That needs to be practiced, right?
Sure. All this does. Yeah.
Go full baseball style.
Yeah. Yeah. Signals, right? Yeah. Yeah. There's three different ways to pace this, and you can use all of them in some form of conjunction. Some of them are simple, some of them are complex. Speed, like Chad went over, is probably the simplest way in terms of the mechanics behind the whole thing, but it's the least specific to the output required. When you turn around, like Chad said, and suddenly that tailwind that you just thought it was your own amazingness is now a headwind. Speed is really complicated with that, right? Because then you're just going to be absolutely blowing yourself up to maintain an average that was unrealistic to maintain anyway. So speed's complex, whether it's pitch, whether it's wind, everything else. So the next one you could do is basically break it down by watt kg. Like what's the average power to weight ratio that we're going to try to maintain? And if you're with riders of differing abilities, that gets a little bit more complex, particularly when the road starts to turn up. Even though you'd think that it's normalized, it isn't perfectly normalized across the board. So, power to weight ratio can be a great way. Like if Alex and I were to do it, that would be really helpful because Alex and I weigh close to the same. We certainly don't have close to the same power to weight ratio. That's for darn sure, but we weigh close to the same. So maybe Alex and I, if we were going out for this, we could look at our head units and just say, all right, our goal is when we're on the front to ride at 4.2 watts per kilogram. That's the goal. And we'll just try to hold that. And that's something that we should be able to sustain. And because of prior experience, we know we can do that. It gets more complicated though, when the profile has less climbing to it. And then it also gets even more complicated when you start to get into, very different rider types. So the most probably complex way, and this is much more relevant when the course is flat and less climby, is you could look at your watts to CDA. First of all, if you can figure out your CDA, good on you, amazing. But if you could do that, that would be pretty sweet, because then you just kind of run some basic math in your head and you're just like, yeah, okay, so I know that Chad's CDA is this and my CDA is this. And we basically just need to hold the watts per CDA on this flat course. And that would equal out to be roughly the same for us, right? So you can do that too. But I think probably the most practical way, and Alex, you and I talked about this, is figure out roughly what sort of power gives you what sort of speed. And then since you have a time goal, it's really easy to figure out what sort of power you'd need to maintain as an average for your group, right?
Yeah. You talked about best bike split, which is super useful to use and stuff like this. I think my approach to answering this question kind of reminds me of like Cape Epic or any stage race like that. Rule number one is leave your ego at the door. Everybody has good days and everybody has bad days. So like Chad was saying, being very vocal about where you're at is super helpful. On climbs, I love to send the quote unquote worst rider in the front. They set the pace where they're comfortable. You're not dropping them off the back. They're in sight of you. So I think, that piece makes it super helpful. You can visually see how they're doing and they can just set a pace that they're comfortable with. nothing worse than putting the, again, quote unquote, worst rider on the front right before a climb. And then someone else goes to the front on the climb and then they don't even get a rest because there's no draft. So it's like just thinking about little things like that, helping where you can, reminding people to eat. Like Chad said, I think normally I fill that like mom role, so to speak, of just like, haven't seen you taking a gel in a while kind of thing on rides like this, and kind of just taking care of the group takes care of yourself. So being the hammer normally means that you're taking care of everybody else and making sure that they're eating, that you're not going too hard on the front. Like it's not a day to show them that you can drop them. It's a day to show them that you can cohesively work in a group and ride 25 miles an hour.
That's a good point. I think that the onus actually falls upon the strongest rider to be the most responsible rider. If you're the one that's in charge of everything in terms of pace and fitness and likely completion time, then you're the one who has to look at everyone else and make sure they're all okay.
And you probably you're below your limits too, more than the other riders. Thusly, you have the headspace to be able to manage these sort of details and make sure that everybody's taken care of.
Yeah, and it's little things too, like that rider pointing like potholes out on the road. Like you have that mental space to do those things. So like protect the other riders in like sketchy spots on the road. And also just like that's when poles can change. Like if there's a long flat section and the rest of the riders are hurting, that's when you can just sit on the front and do a 20-minute turn in a spot where they can actually get a draft and get that rest. And you can just do endurance plus or whatever that power target is for 20 minutes and try to give everybody a reset.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've worked out a 100-mile course, y'all. It's close to where we're at. It's where we've done state TT championships multiple times. It's up in Sierra Valley. And the course has 1,000 feet of climbing over 100 miles. So that's really low for our region.
Damn, you're a hero.
That's about as flat. Yeah. Awesome. It's about as flat as you can get. And it's all right turns instead of left turns, meaning that like we would never have to stop and we could just carry momentum through everything.
Lights.
Yep. And we don't have lights to deal with. You don't have any of that stuff. So looking at that course, if we were trying to do a 4-hour time, our average power at my weight of like 150 pounds would have to be 282 watts. Now, the interesting thing to think about with this is, for me, that's right around, that's like sweet spot to threshold, like the very low end of threshold for me. And if I have 4 other riders, so I'm doing a 1-to-4 work to rest ratio, and I'm just doing something like 1 minute at that pace or 2 minutes at that pace, and then another rider's carrying that pace, that's something that actually is pretty sustainable because I'm not doing VO2 efforts there. I'm riding, kind of low toward the high sweet spot, low threshold zone. And if I do that for a period of 4 hours, it would probably be really hard at the end, but that's absolutely something that we could do. To go even lower than that, if we were to do threshold pulls for me, then I think that we could go even closer to 3 hours and 50 minutes. That would be amazing to be able to pull that off. Chad, can I convince you to train and to come down and join me for a sub 4?
Your timing's actually downright serendipitous because I just recently concluded, I wouldn't get so excited, that anything over 3 hours is just not something I'm doing anymore. So I'm going to need you to
go real fast.
Those numbers.
We need 259, Jonathan. What's the power?
Okay.
We're going to go 33.34 miles.
That's it. That will be very fast. I guess if we get a big enough group of folks, Chad, anything's possible. So
okay.
That would be awesome. Can you imagine having Chad and maybe we get Nate back on a bike again, interested in this? That could be fun. I don't know. It could be really fun. The one thing I think about these efforts, and this is once again ideals, because you should just bring the people that are really interested in this, like your ragtag group of friends, right? Whatever they're like, as long as, it's not putting somebody in a spot where they feel like they're just set up for failure and it's really out of their reach. But otherwise, it is cool to take like a ragtag bunch and do this. But if I was to build this up, like ideally, I would pick athletes that are stronger than me, for sure, that are like similar weight.
Rolling coal.
Yeah, I know, right? Think of what we could do if we had like Keegan, Alex,
Ben King,
putting you behind
Ted
him.
King.
That guy does
Ben
zero
King.
draft.
Yeah, we could bring Standish could do the long diesel pulls for us when he needs to.
He could just do 282 all day.
I know. He's got a bit more CDA than us, though. Just to,
Just perfect.
He's a big
just go
muscly
get
dude.
Wout van Aert. Did you guys hear what he
Why
did
stop
for,
there?
was it 4.5 hours? What his normalized power is? I think it was the day when he went solo.
Oh, what was it?
378 normalized over 4.5 hours.
Oh my gosh.
That doesn't compute. That's like,
It's okay.
That was
It's just a 1-day race.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Just one day.
just
Yeah,
go get
in the
wild
middle
and
of the
sit
tour.
on. That's your day.
I think I
that-
should find a new sport, actually.
That was the day when Quinn Simmons was in the breakaway with him, right? And then he ended up just breaking away and going solo. Was that it?
It had to be that day. Yeah.
Luckily for the
Wow.
group, I think Wout dropped his chain like 2 or 3 times to give him a little bit of rest.
Oh, did I do that again?
Oh
You guys
my
look
gosh.
tired. Let me just try to shift this front thing and the back thing at the
Exactly.
same time.
Yeah, see what we can do. I think this, I've wanted to break 4 hours on 100 miles for quite some time. I've had some road races that haven't been 100 miles, but we were absolutely overpaced to do this in road races for sure.
Yeah.
Even I think
This is a fun goal.
yeah, right. I think I've had even like an 87-mile road race, and our average speed was insane. I want to say that it was close to like 26, 27 miles an hour. It was fast for that. So those are quick days for, I'm no Tour de France rider. So those are fast days for a P12 group where indecision is, where it's rife with indecision. So anyways, I kind of want to do this. Alex, I want to recruit you. Maybe I'll even we could recruit Derek Teal from Dialed Health. We'd have to really govern him though. He just likes to hammer.
He'd be good for the
So-
first 20 or 30 minutes.
Yeah, because he'd be putting in.
And then
hero
you just need to be feeding him snacks the rest of the day.
Yeah, he likes to ride hard. So, anyways, if y'all are interested in doing like this, how fast can I do 100 miles? This could be a good thing. Find a route that's like really flat that you can do, that's safe, that allows you to work together as a group. Put them together. I don't know. It's kind of a fun goal. Ivy, would you join for this too?
Absolutely not.
Oh, come on. You could
Also, in the Chad realm of nothing more than 3 hours, I'm really interested in anymore.
Well,
At least unless it's, fun times endurance pace with your buddy. Sure, I'll ride 4, 5, 6 hours, but
Exactly.
I'm not interested in going hard for anything more than like 2.5, to be
man.
honest.
You have all this like depth of experience with all these pro road races, and where you basically
And team
did this
time
very
trials.
thing.
Hence why
And-
she's reached this conclusion. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why I want her.
Just-
the experience.
I would just see Ivy like starting in the back and then out sprinting us at the end, like the
Yeah.
Strava lag segment.
Yeah, it'd be funny. The funny thing though is like, and people probably, not many people ride with you. Also, everyone always says that I look small on the podcast, and they meet me, I'm bigger, and they probably
I've
have
never
no
had
clue
that.
what we're like. But Ivy is a really strong rider. I know that she does cyclocross and single speed stuff, so you'd think that she's just pure surgy, but Ivy, you have diesel power in you. Like, you have strong, long power. So
Thank you.
if I could,
You
I'm gonna
cannot
keep
flatter
begging
me
for
into
it.
wanting to do this. Sorry.
Thank you.
Nice try.
Ivy,
Moving
you're
on.
amazing.
Her again when her new skin suits come in town.
Yeah, exactly.
You want
I think
to
this will
show
be
off
fun.
that skin suit? We have the ride for you.
There we go. So listeners, maybe you can help me, and of course not pressuring Ivy, but flattering Ivy. And we can get her to do it, or come up with any sort of roster that I should build up for this one to see how fast we can do 100 miles. I'm super into
Road
this. This is
100
just,
mile fantasy team.
yeah, and I probably wouldn't use, I'd be totally fine with people using TT bikes. I wouldn't use my TT bike because I don't hate myself that much. Eventually I'll do
is my TT bike.
yeah,
So I
I'll
will
do a
use mine.
full, I'll do a full Ironman someday. And I don't know how still, I don't know how I'll ride it. Like, the run part will be fine. The swim part, I'll mostly die, but I'll be okay. It's the TT bike sitting in that position for that long. I'm not sure how I do it, but I guess, yeah, I don't know. Maybe Keegan, Russell Finsterwald, Alex, man, I'll be
My
a
guy.
weak link in that one. But surround yourself by people that are stronger than you. Yeah. So, okay, let's go into Sylvia's question. Can we please get an episode devoted to standing? Seated riding versus standing riding are about the same as Swiss cheese and Wednesday. So totally different concepts, night and day. I'm not sure about that much, Sylvia, but yes, they are different. So Sylvia says, while standing, should I lean forward versus stand straight? Should I tip my bike laterally from side to side versus weave the bike? Are there any benefits to training to riding standing at an extended durations, say for 60 minutes. Just, I would surmise that an individual could train this way to build an engine, but on race day, stick to a seated posture so that you're not burning matches unnecessarily. So there's quite a few assumptions here. Sylvia, this is a great question. We're going to get into a lot of them. Finally, Sylvia says, what physiological differences are there regarding standing versus seated pedaling? I've been practicing standing and have noticed that my midsection is trimmed up substantially, allowing me to break through a body comp plateau. That may be misattribution, but it could be the case, right? There could be any number of different factors at play here, Sylvia. And finally, can we acknowledge that in nearly every unbound photo of Keegan Swenson, he is standing? That's honestly what got me thinking about all this, but I feel like he's onto something. Much love, TrainerRoad from Sylvia. Yeah, Alex.
I'd just like to point out, I spent many a time racing with Keegan. Does not stand up that often. I think at Unbound, it's just such a long race that there's a combination of lucky, I don't know if lucky is the right word, but funny photography. And he's probably just trying to stretch out after 9 hours on the bike. So
just better
can
photos.
confirm.
That makes for better photos. And
he sits down a whole lot, and he has one of those riding styles you can see from like 5 miles away.
Yeah.
Just
seated power.
Seated pretty low cadence, kind of on par with most of the people that came from mountain biking.
Yep, for sure. And seated power is king. It's a more efficient, just physically speaking, a more efficient position to be in when you're
I will say there are exceptions, but it's definitely not the rule. Like I think of Contador on the road side and Stefan Tempier on the mountain bike side. There's people who've made it work and just have massive amount of torque, going back to single speed. But yeah, 99 times out of 100, 99,000 out of 10,000, 100,000. I mean, most of the time seated's going to get you the job done with less energy spent.
Yeah, for sure. Chad, you have some studies on this that maybe can answer the various questions that Sylvia said.
Yeah,
or Sylvia asked.
This is going to go just a little bit deep. It's not like full on get comfy 20, 30 minutes ahead sort of business, but it is the one question: what physiological differences are there regarding standing instead of seated, is the tack that I took. So all the other stuff about leaning and lateral weaving and all that stuff we can talk about after I discuss the physiology, and of course we can interject anytime in between it. But I reduced this down to basically, I think, a study that set the stage, a study that took everybody off course, myself included, and then a couple studies that reestablish what we know and what makes sense and what we've all just said. It's out there. I think we're all coming from the right place in the at least from the research, the perspective of the research. So some 30 years ago, Stone and Hull did a study that noted that standing allows riders to exert more force, and more force actually exceeding that of their rider weight. So you weigh 180 pounds, you can actually put more force on the pedal than all your body weight. This is interesting. It's neat to see it on paper. Also, that the power phase occurs a little bit later in the pedal stroke. Also, that arm movement synchronizes with leg movement. So things that maybe at the time weren't obvious, but are certainly obvious to us now. But here's some research that maybe kicked it all off. Could have been something that preceded it, but this is the study that I'm gonna cite. And this suggests a couple of things. First, that slight changes occur in the way the leg muscles are utilized. So when you're seated versus standing, there are changes. When people talk about, I need to get out of the saddle to stretch, I need to get out of the saddle to kind of stress my legs in a different manner, that stuff that carries, that's real. And then it also suggests that arm involvement can increase the overall toll on the body, the total work that we're doing. And I'll expand on that in a bit. So that's all in line with what we would expect. And then around 2002, and I didn't read this study in 2002, rather I read it at the height of my racing prowess when I was doing best, and it messed with me. It made me think, it made me draw some incorrect, I think, conclusions, or at least some too tidy conclusions. And it was a study, and let me be clear, I don't think the authors had any nefarious intentions with this at all. I just think they derived too simple an outcome from something that's far more complex. 2002, Millett and colleagues observed that gross efficiency and economy, which is essentially the power produced relative to the energy consumed, as compared to, or when seated versus standing. And they took 8 well-trained cyclists, had them do 5 trials, 6 minutes each, and they had them work at 70% of peak power output, which is my first criticism, which is in the ballpark for most riders, 90% of FTP. They did seated flat, whether they were on a velodrome. They did seated climbing, standing climbing, and then they tacked on some 30-second sprints, standing and seated, which yielded very obvious findings. But relative to the more steady state stuff, their findings were that gross efficiency and cycling economy are not different regardless. Heart rate was significantly higher when standing, and breathing was too. That's not surprising considering there's a linear relationship to those two things when we work in a steady state manner. Standing sprints are substantially more powerful. Yep, that's true. And their overall conclusion, and here's where it all breaks down, and here's what messed with me for a very long time. The gradient or body position appears to have a negligible effect on external efficiency in field-based high-intensity cycling exercise. So let the criticisms fly. First off, 70% of peak power output is roughly, as I stated, 90% of FTP for most riders. That's not high intensity. And I'm not talking semantics either. Rather, the body position's impact on high intensity work is not really up for discussion here. I don't consider this high intensity work, and I don't think it's considered high intensity work by most exercise scientists. 6 minutes isn't long enough to assess broad, meaningful changes in efficiency or economy. It's just too short of a duration to draw such long-range conclusions. 5.3% was the average gradient that they used, and it doesn't speak for all rideable grades. It simply doesn't. They can range quite widely, and the authors acknowledge this to their credit. And they all, so really, if we back up and we look at what they're claiming here, all they can really say is that when working at 75% of peak power output for 6 minutes on a 5.3% grade, body position appears to have a negligible effect on external efficiency. That I can get behind, but they can't say in high intensity cycling, they can't say on all grades, because those statements give the impression that there's no efficiency or economy incentive to be had by riding seated at really common power outputs and durations. That standing is no more of a resource suck at this very typical effort duration combination. I mean, many of us climb at 90% of FTP for handfuls of minutes at a time. I mean, that's a pretty common pace to settle into when you're trying to get up over a climb. They didn't mention rider biomechanics at all, and the authors acknowledged this. That was one of their limitations. And there was just too many things wrong with this, too simplistic a view. And if you read the abstract, if you read the title, then you read the abstract, and then you read the conclusion, you're just like, oh, so why do I care? I can just stand, I can stay seated. It doesn't really affect me either way. In this very specific scenario, maybe that's true. So let's undo some of this criticism with a couple of more recent studies. First was to 2008 in the Journal of Sports Sciences. Hansen and Waldland found things that you might reasonably expect, and that there's no difference in time to exhaustion at 86% in their case of power VO2 max. And this equates roughly to threshold, little above threshold probably for most riders, whether in the saddle or out of the saddle, but at 10% grades. And this to me pencils, because in my opinion, when you're on a steep grade and you're a little above FTP, whether you're standing or seated, probably true. It's probably pretty even. They also noted that when working at 165% of your peak power output, and to be clear, that's basically what you get with a ramp test, which is going to be somewhere in the ballpark of 200% of FTP, standing yields the highest power output. Again, this is not a surprise. I don't know why they keep investigating this. You're going to be stronger when you're out of the saddle. Let's just leave it alone. But what was most interesting with this study, why I flagged this one, is that they identified 94% of peak power output, which is somewhere in the 110, 115% of FTP for most riders, that at that particular power output is the seated standing transition intensity. So across all these riders, all these trials on a 10% grade, they all chose to stand as something that was closely akin to the last step or two of a ramp test, where we're all jonesing to get out of the saddle. I mean, this makes perfect sense. So it was just cool to see it quantify. It's like, yeah, no, that's exactly when I really desperately want to stand. And that's why people ask us, can I stand on the ramp test? And all those people are asking for those last two or one step, just so they can eke a little more power out of it.
Yeah.
And then finally, just recently, just a couple of years ago, Berkemeyer in the International Journal of Exercise Science. And I think this is probably the most relevant research regarding Sylvia's questions. And the title actually states as much: physiological and biomechanical differences between seated and standing uphill cycling. And I'm going to assume she means uphill, because I don't think too many people are worried about standing on flat roads, certainly not on a downhill, unless they're jumping away, and they know that's going to be more costly. You're going to generate a heck of a lot more power. You're drilling it. Yes, it's going to cost you more. But what this study did was 3 different studies, and each of them analyzed separate things. The first one looked at VO2 and heart rate, so both your oxygen uptake and your heart rate. Second one looked at muscle activation, and the third one looked at breathing and pedaling entrainment. So basically the rhythm that develops between breathing and pedaling. And they confirmed what we'd sensibly expect. First off, that average heart rate and oxygen uptake, VO2, were significantly elevated when standing. That muscle activation for certain muscles changes, and for some, it doesn't alter much at all. And also that there's a lot of variability across riders. And what would you attribute that to but anthropometric differences, different shapes and sizes of bodies, coordination differences, differences in skill level. I mean, some people practice this stuff relentlessly. Some people don't do it unless they absolutely have to. And then the changes in breathing pedaling ratios that happened, I don't think that's especially relevant here. But overall, they noted in their words, uphill cycling while standing results in decreased cycling economy due to physiological and biomechanical variations compared to riding seated. So exactly what you would expect, exactly what we feel every time we do it. But of note, and again, why this particular study stood out and why I deemed it exceptionally valid is because they did all 3 of these trials on a treadmill. So a 3x2 meter treadmill, which, riding a bike on a treadmill, which I find far more specific to outdoor demands, and certainly just kind of wipes out all the non-trainer efficiencies or bonuses you get when your wheel's locked in and you can't incorporate any body English when you don't really need to use the hips or the torso for balance, et cetera. And yeah, the riders were tethered. I know someone will probably point this out, but it was an upper body harness. And I fully expect that the researchers limited any of the compounding benefits of that. They don't have them suspended above their bike. Otherwise, they're just going to totally invalidate their findings. So the point is if we're going to lean into any study on this matter, this one strikes me as amongst the most trustworthy simply because of the use of the treadmill.
Yeah, it's just most, I guess, directly representative of the experience that we would have when we're outside riding.
Totally.
And in most cases, those harnesses are there to catch them when they go off the treadmill.
Exactly. I don't think there's any benefit to be had
up.
unless they completely lose control.
Yeah, absolutely. One of those treadmills would be sweet to have, man.
I think so, especially for any research. If you can't do it in the field and you got to do it in a lab environment, I think that's the way to go.
I don't even want it for research. I just want personally, it'd be nice to do
just
workouts on
fun.
it. So yeah, exactly. Yeah. Ride rollers. They're kind of like a rudimentary version of that. So I guess in summary, Chad, what would you say in this case about seated versus standing?
Just that there's a trade-off. I mean, if you need to generate more power, then you're sacrificing efficiency economy. It's going to cost more to do more work. That's just the gist of it. If you need to get up and stretch a bit, alter the muscle recruitment patterns, it absolutely is something that's on the table. But it's more costly. It's going to take more. And they looked at, how the arm involvement affected VO2. You're using more oxygen because now you're using your arm muscles too. But what about all the other muscles that come into play when you rise out of the saddle? I mean, you're effectively removing one of probably your most stable point of support in the bike saddle, and now your hips are floating instead of anchored. So all the muscles that control the hips that are trying to control moving legs that are trying to put power into pedals. I mean, there's just going to be more muscular recruitment. More muscular recruitment means more oxygen uptake, means lower efficiency. For the same amount of work, for the same amount of power to the pedals, your body's doing more work.
Yeah. Ivy, how do you manage this? Because I'm thinking of your career. You've been like pro road racer, track racing, cyclocross, single speed cyclocross, track locross, now Tahoe Trail 100 relay winner. So you've done like tons of stuff. How do you view standing, and has that changed as you've done the different disciplines? And do you find that you have like almost like bad habits you have to break from going from one discipline to another?
Totally. When Chad was talking about all this, I was thinking about how much my riding style has changed from being the kind of rider that wants to get out of the saddle, out of the corners a lot, like especially in crits. Like I just like to get on top of the speed quick, and I don't know. And I like to accelerate fast out of corners and cross and get going again. But that was super inefficient. And I found that the more I tried to stay seated, in fact, like some of my best crit wins were because I focused on staying seated as much as I could through the whole race. And as a result, my sprint, when it mattered, when I needed to get out of the saddle, was so much more effective and powerful because I had all these matches in the bank waiting because I hadn't gotten out of the saddle out of every single corner for no reason at all. So my riding style has changed a lot in that way. And especially when I first started racing cross, I was so bad at carrying speed through corners, and like XC as well. I would almost stop in corners and then get out of it and be like, oh no, I'm still racing, and just put out this huge effort out of the saddle to get going again. And the more I've been able to mitigate that, the better I am at the end of the race, especially like with cross, trying to turn out a really fast last couple laps. I find that the more I can stay seated, the better power I have in the last couple laps.
Yeah, it saves you. How do you find good tips, Ivy? Alex, how do you use standing, if that makes sense? But like, is it typically for you, is it more of just like a stretching and comfort thing?
That's kind of affirming listening to all those studies. I find at like 120%, that's when I'm like begging to stand up. Steeper stuff too, I just feel like it's more comfortable. And that might actually also be like, if you think about on something really steep, your bike fit rotates. So naturally I kind of want to get more forward. So I tend to do it on steeper stuff as well. And then, I mean, you see this a lot in World Cups as well. If you were paying attention to like the start finish, anytime they get on like a stable terrain, like road or something, you'll see them take the opportunity to kind of stretch their back, move their hips around. And that tends to be what I do when I kind of have that moment in a race, is just to kind of, relieve the hamstrings a little bit, kind of stretch out the back a touch and just kind of reset and change the muscle groups. Like Ivy, it's something that I actually had to train, I'd say 2 or 3 years ago now. I would find myself just standing for like really long time, like 10 minutes, not straight, but like majority of it would be standing. And I had to focus on like doing the threshold effort seated. And I kind of went completely to the other side of things. So I would do in the winter, I would really focus as we kind of ramped up, because I found it hard to just switch mid-season at that power level to seated. Is at the beginning of the next season, I would focus on doing everything seated. So the sweet spot was, and I would shoot for 95% of the time seated. So like I could still stand to stretch. It wasn't like if your butt's on fire, stay seated kind of thing, but like really focus on doing those efforts seated and having that efficiency. And then like Ivy was saying, I don't think you really have to train the standing kind of thing, but if you can do most of your work seated, that standing becomes more powerful because you have more energy to do it. So yeah, pretty much what the studies are saying are stuff that I do as well.
And in terms of the questions that you asked Sylvia about leaning forward versus standing straight, or tipping versus weaving, everyone's going to be a bit different, and it will change on the bike. Alex and I were talking about this. On mountain bikes or gravel bikes, you can't lean forward too much or else you lose traction. And
unless you want to do sweet skids.
Yeah, exactly. Despite what Nate was telling us about keeping traction going up a steep gravel road. But you can't lean forward too much just because it removes traction from the back. So you'll develop a specific style that will work in different situations. The tipping thing a lot of the time is used a bit more for leverage, whereas weaving tends to be used a bit more when traction is at play, and that's a difficult thing. But when you just tip your bike and then you're absolute, like Chad said, you're using your body weight and everything to get more force into those pedals. That's what you'll see when people have more traction to play with. But it's really all depending on what you like to do. I will say that, just as we've mentioned before with sprinting, it can be very easy to develop like bad habits with leaning too far forward with sprint, or with just being out of the saddle. That can cause a light back end. I'm sure all of us have seen situations where an athlete's like out of the saddle, not pedaling super hard, but just out of the saddle, leaning too far forward, and their back wheel, whether it hits a pebble, hits a little pothole, anything else like that, it creates like a sketchy situation because they'll lose traction for a second, or their wheel will hop, and it can cause things. So you want to be, balanced on the bike for sure. But there is no right tip, lean, or tip weave, or lean, stand straight, everything else. You're just trying to stay balanced and even and efficient on the bike. And that will change on the bike and change depending on the road. So
yeah, and you kind of learn to spot those sections of course that you can stand. Like if you see a climb and there's like a clean strip of dirt, you're like, okay, this is kind of my opportunity to stand, to stretch, and it doesn't really matter where my body weight is. But I think yeah, it's another vote for suited for that traction piece. When you're in the saddle, you're naturally putting more pressure on that rear wheel and you're going to get more traction out of it.
Yeah, and in most cases, as long as you have like a disciplined pedal stroke, you're also going to have more constant pressure on that back wheel rather than pressure that's weighting and unweighting. And that weighting and unweighting is what can cause you to lose that traction in that moment, just through silly lack of coordination when you're seeing cross-eyed because you're really tired. So it can cause some things.
You may even lose the extra power that you're getting from standing if you're not putting it to going forward. So.
Yeah, how many times, I'm sure you guys have done this too, guys and gal, like you stand up to go put out more power, but the traction's so limiting, they end up using so much energy just to try to maintain traction that it's like, well, why am I even out of the saddle? Like I could be in the saddle.
Never happened.
Yeah, I could be in the saddle more efficient. So yeah, let's go into Mike's question. He says, context, aero helmets are all the rage, but they A, often have less ventilation, and B, tend to have nebulous performance improvement claims, hamstrung by different testing metrics per manufacturer, and probably test environments that are broadly not reflective of true riding conditions. I would say that I respect that level of skepticism toward the claims for sure. I'm not sure that I would say that they have nebulous performance improvement claims across the board, though, because I do think that there is improvement in general. However, specific studies and everything, or specific wind tunnel tests, yeah, there's a lot of variability with that for sure. Like, I can't help but think even the angle that somebody holds their head at on the bike has to have an impact on the drag that the helmet has.
Yep.
Or the angle of the helmet. Looking at you, Roglic.
Yep.
Yeah.
With all this.
Yeah. Or like, who's oh my gosh, I don't know why I'm blanking on his name. Won the Giro 2 years ago, rides for Ineos. And
Carapaz?
No, not Carapaz. Goodness
Egan?
gracious. No. Teo Gegenhardt. He wears his helmet famously toward the back of his head, right? So yeah, you can see the hairline. So I can't help but think that all of that stuff might even have a bigger effect on the drag of the helmet than just like one helmet to another. So I do respect that skepticism for sure.
Probably did wind tunnel testing though. Maybe his like chin is so low that like it levels it with how aero he is.
I can't help but think that, Ineos doesn't leave a stone unturned, right? We know they're famous for that.
I would think not. Yeah.
Yeah.
But Teo is also a character in himself.
Yeah. What an impressive athlete that guy is in person.
He's
in general.
awesome.
It's pretty great.
He's a good person. Yeah.
Yeah. As many of us know from indoor training, cooling has a massive impact on performance and RPE, but it tends to be less of a factor or consideration for outdoor rides because of the amount of airflow you get over the body outdoors. So my question, what would you all think about the trade-off between an aero helmet and a well-ventilated helmet from a performance perspective? For example, would you try to find a specific temperature for yourself, at which point it is more performant to use a well-ventilated helmet with lesser aerodynamic qualities? Personally, my head never feels hot, but I recognize that it's a pretty crucial surface area for cooling and has some pretty important hardware housed up there indeed. I'm primarily asking the question as it relates to dynamic riding styles, road, gravel, mountain, versus riding in a very static position, such as a time trial. The latter seems to have a more clear aero value proposition. Chad, you have studies on this.
Yep. First off, kudos on your use of the word performant, adding that one to the vocab.
It was a very well-written question, Mike. You, deserve, I don't know, a TrainerRoad versus like an Emmy. I don't know what it is, but yeah, well done. It was good.
So I actually have 5 studies, and I picked each of them because and I'll be succinct with each of them. This won't be a long dive or deep dive.
Get ready.
But
2 hours long.
We've already touched on all of it. It's a super complex matter. That's what it comes down to, and it's ever changing depending on what you want from each scenario. So let's start 2002 with Chabrol, who just simply noted that saddle position, helmet inclination, addition of a visor can all interplay with different effects. So it's not even having all the right things, it's having all the right things and in the right combination. So there's a first note of complexity. 2017, Abdullah and colleagues noted that the position of teardrop helmets, so we're talking distinctly aero helmets, drastically impact the aerodynamics. We know all this now, but at the time, this was a bit revelatory. But in particular, they had the eyes on the horizon, which was the 0-degree pitch, versus the eyes down, which is the 25-degree pitch. And more importantly, this just illustrates that aero drag changes with the helmet shape. And, basically aero helmets are in fact more aero by and large, maybe period. That rider speed affects aerodynamics. So your whole coefficient of drag actually increases at different rates as your speed rises. So again, aero helmets, once again, reign supreme. And then the pitch angle of your head, your intended position plus your intended helmet can actually negatively impact your aerodynamics. I mean, you're probably going to get a bump in aerodynamics, but if you interface these things improperly, you're going to cut into that benefit a bit. So the takeaway is simply how you're going to ride your bike may not marry well with your particular aero lid. And then same year, Beaumont basically just drove home these same conclusions, but more specifically looked at the importance of how your helmet marries to the shape of your back. And then Novak in 2019, this was interesting because they used a mechanical mechanism in the helmet to actually alter airflow. So you could actually adjust, how much airflow you're getting based on whatever, maybe it's on a time trial and you're heading up a hill now. So you want to knock the airflow all the way up to 5 out of 5, and then on the downhill and knock it back down to 1, whatever. But this demonstrated that there's a trade-off, that greater ventilation actually yields more aero drag. So again, it's a trade-off, and different events shift the importance between aerodynamics and cooling. Different scenarios in single events shift the importance of aerodynamics versus cooling. And then finally, Basri, just a couple of years ago, 2020, basically confirms that aerodynamics are in fact as fickle as we think. And just modifying the tail flap of the helmet actually drastically affected the aero drag. They have just different just the very end of the helmet, like the last 2 inches, they had it at different angles, and there were changes typically favorably, but then they did, I think, a negative 10-degree angle where they dipped down, where it almost looked like it was pointing into the back, like digging into the rider's spine. And I think they just modeled it. I don't know if they actually did it, but in that was a negative impact. So that little tweak downward 10 degrees of the end of the helmet actually had a negative impact on aerodynamics. So I think really this just comes down to a question of just how marginal are you willing to make your gains? How much work are you willing to develop or put into this? Because an aero helmet probably gets you 80% of the sought after advantages you're looking for. But if you want to optimize, it can be a tremendously extensive and expensive process. Wind tunnels and trying this combination and this body position, and the amount of work and resources you're going to have to funnel into it are going to be pretty vast.
Yeah. This is, I feel like this is a situation where we have data and it proves something and it's very straightforward, but it's in a scenario that may not replicate real world conditions because it's just too complicated. Chad, how many people, and Ivy, actually, I'll ask Ivy, how many people have you seen at TTs and road races with helmets worn in such a way that's like absolutely not safe, but it's the most aerodynamic, right? It's super common.
And then you look at their fit and I'm like, oh, you could be dropping your handlebars by like 3 or 4 centimeters probably, and get like so much more advantage than what they're doing with the way they're wearing their helmet. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. It all matters. Like helmets tend to slip down on my forehead and they want to rest low. But if I do that with my TT helmet, for example, or if I had a helmet with a really long tail, anything else like that, or even just an aero road helmet, if I let it do that, then it sticks that tail up of the helmet really high. And it's probably negating a lot of the benefits. So you kind of have to you have to take the responsibility of holding that, or I guess using the equipment appropriately. Now,
fast equipment is fast if you use it right. Right.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. I guess let's hone in on that question of temperature, because I think that there's more to your head being hot, perhaps, than most people figure. Your head gets hot, your brain gets hot. That's absolutely a spot that your body cares about. And if it feels hot, it's going to let you know, and it's going to throw alarm bells, and RPE will raise when your head is too hot. This is, if you look at how most people have their air conditioners set in their car, they almost always have them blowing at like the face and the head, right? And that's what we typically have. If you even have fans on and when you're training indoors, but you don't have a fan hitting your face, it's amazing the RPE difference. You could have your whole body cooling, but you don't have that face and head cooling off, and it's really tough. And there are many cases where I go, no, I'm using the not aero helmet because it's going to be above a certain amount. And for me, if it's above 80 degrees, I'm going to start weighing that decision depending on the average speed of what I'm going to be riding. And that's 80 degrees Fahrenheit. That's where I really need to start making decisions based on the speed that I'm going to have through the race. Like for Tahoe Trail 100, for example, it's not going to be that hot for me because I start early in the morning on that first lap. I'm absolutely using my aero helmet because I think looking at like average speed too, the speed will probably be somewhere around like 13 miles an hour or so. So that's right where aero starts to make a difference, but that's average speed. So there's a ton of linear feet on that course
Some
where
really fast sections. Yeah.
where that aerodynamic advantage will make a profound difference. That's why Ivy's talking about a skin suit and thinking of using that, because there's prolonged sections of high speed. It absolutely will make a difference, even if your average speed is a bit lower, you know?
Yeah.
Alex, how do you weigh this? Because you have the two choices. You have the evade and then you have the prevail. So you have like an airy helmet and an aero helmet. How do you pick?
Yeah. We just released the Prevail 3 and the Evade 3. And it's interesting that this question comes up now because the product brief for the Evade 3 was actually not to make it any more aero. It was already leading in class through specialized testing. So the goal was to make it more ventilated so that people could use this aero helmet in more situations. So it's exactly what you're talking about, Mike, is they're trying to make it so that this aero helmet is the choice most of the time. And I think that's been a continued progression. Like the first Evade was a very hot helmet in my opinion. And then the Evade 2 was faster and a little more ventilated. And now this Evade 3 is on par with the Evade 2, but I think it was 15% more ventilation. And so I personally I think coming from mountain bike racing where the average speed is lower, so the gain is also lower, always lean towards being cool over an aero helmet. That changes. Like we just did a lake lap the other day and it was going to be warm, but you're also going 20 miles an hour. So you're getting more ventilation through the helmet. So it's kind of a dynamic approach to how I do it. I think being with mountain biking, that's kind of how I approach aero as a whole. Like if it's not going to make a performance difference anywhere else, I'll do it. Like I wear a skin suit whenever I mountain bike race, regardless of the course or average speed, just because I don't think it's any hotter or any compromise anywhere else. And if there is something to be gained from having a skin suit, then I'll take it. Yeah, for Tahoe Trail, I'll personally use the Prevail, but that's because my second lap could be quite hot. And I feel like that helmet will help reduce the heat, especially, like I said, that climb coming from lap 1 to lap 2, where you do kind of the super climb of both climbs. I'd rather stay cool and be able to do that.
Alex, with the changes in the Evade, did they have to sacrifice some of the aerodynamic benefit to increase the cooling, that 15%?
No, from my understanding, talking about the tail end, they redid the tail end to be quicker, and then they increased the ventilation up front. So it's a net zero loss. Nice. So it's exactly as fast as the Evade 2. And back to Mike's question, I do like how Specialized tests because we do have a wind tunnel on site in Morgan Hill. So we're able to test at speeds that you ride. Again, I do think it's way too complex when you're comparing like a Giro to a Specialized to a third helmet because they're not all speaking the same language. But I think the one thing you can be confident in is that an aero helmet is faster. I think maybe comparing like this one's 17 seconds faster and this one's 19 is very difficult to get apples to apples. But within a lineup of whatever helmet brand you choose, the aero helmet will be faster. It's just maybe you can't get it down to that like, oh, it's going to be exactly 7 seconds faster. But I think my decision comes back down to like my advice to Ivy on stopping at the feed zone is the difference between a Prevail and Evade is seconds. But if I overheat, it's going to be minutes.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and the heat can absolutely just buckle you. For all of us listening, remember that. So
just a bit of anecdote, but around here, 90s, like low 90s seems to be the height of it. And I've ridden numerous days in roughly that temperature, and I almost always finish my ride on a particular climb. And over the last couple of rides, I've stopped wearing my skull cap And it's made an incredible difference. And this is just a light little piece of fabric, just to basically as a form of sunscreen, rather than put sunscreen on my head and get vent shaped suntans on my head.
Why
I
do you
wear
need to
that
put
thing.
sunscreen on your head, Chad?
Okay. I'll just stop. But it's made a noticeable difference. And this climb in particular has a reputation that I've noticed over the last few ascents, that there's no wind. It's pretty bare. There's no tree cover. It's just hot and it's consistent. So this one little change has had a verifiable impact, personally speaking, of course.
So John, we're buzzing our hair before the race, right?
Let's do it.
Yes. You won't regret it, at least not while racing.
We're not buzzing. We're going to bick that thing. We're going to, yeah.
All the performance gains.
You might want a little texture though to steer the water. Otherwise, you're just going to sweat right in your face.
That's
You can just make channels that align with your helmet.
Totally.
There's a whole different level
commit.
These are things I've never even thought about, Chad, that I've taken for granted that you do have to think about. So I think this is, and when in doubt for most road racers, it's probably best to go to an aero road helmet. When in doubt for a mountain biker, it's probably best to go for one that's more ventilated. If you're riding a really hot scenario, you do a lot of climbing, you'll probably lean more toward ventilated. If you do a lot of flat stuff and you're perhaps not living in a hot area, then you'll want to go to something that is more, faster, more aerodynamic. So
you can also think, I feel like in road racing, if you can like sit in the group and it ends on like a 20-minute climb, maybe that more ventilated helmet is where it matters in terms of where you're racing. But then also, like, if you think about a crit or a rolling road race, it's one, the gains as your speed goes up are greater. And then also two, as you go faster, there's more air flowing through the helmet naturally. So I think, I agree. I would go aero most of the time on the road and probably ventilate on the mountain.
That's a whole other conversation too, because the group dynamics impact it. If you're sitting in a peloton, who cares what your helmet is? But if you're solo on a climb, you definitely care what your helmet is.
Well, actually, even relatively speaking, between equipment changes you can make, the helmet probably still matters more than something like a frame when you're riding in a group. The helmet's going to be likely to catch a bit more air than the crazy expensive upgrades that we would do to wheels or to the frame or to anything else. Because if you're riding in a group, who cares? Like, you're getting sucked along, right? You might even have a vacuum. So, but in the head, I guess, will protrude a bit more, but it's probably going to be negligible if you're in that group. So it's really about
the body always matters more than the bike from what we've seen. Like, the skin suit is the biggest thing you can do to your aero performance gains. And then I think it's followed by helmet and then frame. Like, the difference between a Prevail and a Vade, I believe, is greater than hiding your cables on your aero bike.
Which is pretty crazy. So you wouldn't
things we
think
focus
that,
on is interesting.
Yeah.
Like a good fitting skin suit is going to be your biggest get. And you could probably get a good one for like $300 or $400.
And Alex, you use DNA, is that correct?
Yeah, DNA Cycling out of Utah.
They make a really, really good 2-in-1 skin suit. Really good.
So comfy.
It's comfy.
Yeah.
It's not like it doesn't come with a compromise of discomfort. So yeah.
Super comfy. I love it. And then also, like, from a heat perspective, it's like my thought process is always like the straps of the bib and then where you double on the jersey. So you have a couple pieces of double fabric. On the skin suit, you're always going to be a little cooler because they use the same fabrics.
Heat stuff, cooling. Is it super trivial that I asked Belle to send me a fresh white XR instead of my normal, like, dark gray one? Like, is that just me? Do you think that?
No, I think it's got to hold and radiate heat, right? Black objects typically do retain that heat. And so, I mean, absolutely. I use white helmets for a reason. It's for that very reason, because I don't want my head to get hot, and I'm not sure that that's really going to make a massive difference, but it's something small. And I figure
so why he uses white socks and white shoes, guys.
That's right. That's right.
Not for looks.
No, it's all pure performance and white gloves. Yeah.
Don't want hot feet.
That's it. Yeah. Hot feet are pretty miserable too, huh? Hot feet,
Actually
hot head. Two things really bad. And your hands, like, if you're using black gloves, your hands vent a huge amount of heat through your palm, which you're kind of stuck there because you're probably on your bars. But then on the back of your hands, that's the spot where you vent a huge amount of heat. You'll even see it, like, Kona. I remember one year, maybe Chad, did we see this or did we talk about it? But athletes had like specific like ice packs that were set up on their hands, on the palms of their hands, on their aero bars.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Nationals. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that in line with what you just mentioned, I don't wear gloves anymore, and it's largely a cooling thing. It makes a surprising impact. Hot hands, hot feet, hot head. They're big deals.
Yeah.
At the start of nationals in Pennsylvania, where it's crazy humid, we used to have like bowls of ice water, and you would actually hold your hands in this bowl of ice water. But it's the same thing. It's like a pre-cooling strategy.
Yep.
Like your hands and your feet are huge radiators, so it's essentially as cold as you can stay. Another trick is like if you take a 5-minute cold shower before your race, like that's always helped me in super hot conditions. And then like Ivy was saying, for Tahoe Trail, ice socks, ice vests, all those are super helpful. Keeping water on your body, especially at high altitude, what Jonathan was saying, it evaporates pretty quickly. So helping your sweat system by throwing some water on you as well, get that evaporative cooling. And then also doing it in strategic spots, like on Tahoe Trail, that back section, that's that whole fire road. If you throw some water on before then, like a fan.
Yep, because you carry so much speed, right? So good stuff. Good practical conversations. We have one live question that I said I would address. And for those that want to submit questions to the podcast, you can do it at trainerroad.com/podcast. Please do that this week. We want to hear your training questions, even if they're kind of like ponderous hypotheticals, like we addressed some of them today. We like those ones. They're fun. So send them to trainerroad.com/podcast. One quick one from the live chat. It says, how would you race a 90 kilometer, 70.3 bike relay, knowing that you don't have to conserve energy for a run? Is there a specific I have to target for these events? So for a 70.3, like really high performing athletes, you'll see them running like 0.85, even up to like even higher than that. Then they're somehow able to run off the bike in incredible ways. It's super impressive to see. 70.3 distance is kind of like in one way a bit trickier in my mind, because you kind of have to fly a little closer to the sun, right, Chad? But it's still long enough that it's really easy for that to bite you. It's really tricky distance for that reason. But what would you say, Chad, in this case? I mean, typically I would suggest people like, 0.8 to 0.85, somewhere around there. But in this case, they aren't doing the run. Yeah.
So 0.85 is a good starting point. I've seen times or IFs of 0.90, 0.91 in 70.3s, and they still run well afterwards. So those are the exceptional few, and those are the people who have pushed their aerobic capacities way, way, way up there. But 0.85 is probably a good recommendation.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you can lift from there toward the second half of the race if you feel like you can, right, Chad? Yeah.
There's climbing. Keep in mind that power goes further on climbs. So
yes.
If you have a band, I would probably say like end plus on the flats and sweet spot on the climbs. That's like a rough.
Good way to balance it. Yeah. All right.
You have to eat a lot because you're pedaling a lot on Ironmans. I always feel like it's like a sweet spot effort, like so many kgs.
Yeah, for sure. Ivy, you and I. So if anybody wants to see us at Tahoe Trail 100, come say hi. I might not say hi before the race. Sorry, I'm in the zone, Chief. We can catch up afterward. But Ivy will be like making pour overs over there in the transition area. So go chat with Ivy. We'll see you there at the race. If you see Alex when he probably just rips past us, lapping us, say great job, way to go, and give him some support. Alex, I think you're going to be racing Jeff Kabush this time. Maybe Levi Leipheimer too. Is Levi doing it? I'm not sure. Yeah. So, I think we lost Alex's mic. Hopefully not. There we go. He's there. Maybe, kind of. So anyways, it's going to be a good race. Tune in and go follow TrainerRoad on Instagram. Submit your podcast questions at trainerroad.com/podcast and like this video on YouTube. Rate this podcast, share it with your friends, and check out the Cycling Science Explained video all about, we have a ton of them coming up. I've almost said the next one coming up. Had to keep that one back, but sprint intensity training, and stay tuned for the next one. It's going to be exciting. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.